Hey, this is Cam with Blacktail Studio, and this is a $250 chunk of locally salvaged Oregon black walnut that I got. And some of you out there, if you're woodworkers, you might be thinking, where could anybody ever buy that for only $250? And this was a little bit before the epoxy craze was as wild as it is now, where people want the big voids and the big defects. And back then, this slab wasn't very desirable. My wood supplier said, hey, I got this random chunk. It's a little bit thin. Got a big knot in the middle or big hole in the middle, only $250. And so I was like, yeah, sure. So it actually leaned up in my shop for probably the better part of a year before I found a client that was able to commission it. And the cool thing for me is this client ended up paying $7,700 just for the top. He had his own base for it. So not bad profit margins on a table like this, but it was still going to be a lot of work. I spent an hour or so doing about as complicated of math as I'm capable of to try to get the volume close, and in the end I still messed that up. And what I'm using here is the super clear epoxy, which ironically is dyed jet black, so it's incredibly unclear, but that is by design. And when you're mixing epoxy, anytime you're doing anything with epoxy, one of the only things you can't come back from is unmixed or partially mixed epoxy. So I spend an obscene amount of time making sure everything is perfectly mixed. The epoxy manufacturers will say that their epoxy cures in about 72 hours, and that's kind of partially true. It is hard after about 48 to 72 hours, but it continues to cure for a couple of weeks. So I generally let it sit for at least 2 weeks, sometimes 3 weeks if it's a little bit cool in my shop, before I move on to the planing and surfacing part. And the reason is that epoxy, it'll be firm, but it just won't be quite as hard as it will be after a couple of weeks. And depending on the finish you use, that could actually lead to like a wrinkly finish. If that epoxy continues to shrink, it'll actually shrink that epoxy and just make it look a little bit wrinkly. There are some misconceptions about what these C channels actually do in the table. Some people think they hold that wood and epoxy together, but what they really do is they just kind of keep that wood nice and flat. These big wide slabs, they want to just kind of cup and twist and bow a little bit, and using these C channels in there to keep everything just kind of snugged up will keep that wood staying perfectly flat for years. And if you didn't use these, you could use something like a wood apron, which is kind of the traditional woodworking method of doing things, but I like to have a little bit more of a low profile look to my table so you can't see anything when you look at it from the side. If you have ever wanted to build a wood and epoxy table, but you're a little intimidated, you don't want to spend all that money on that wood and all the money on the epoxy just to have something go wrong, I finally made a very detailed virtual epoxy workshop. It's like 3.5 hours long, and it's kind of like a Skillshare or a masterclass where I go through absolutely every step from the very start to the very end of building a wood and epoxy table. And I tell people that there's no guarantees that it's going to give you a perfect epoxy table, but what it will do is you get to skip the learning curve. You get to skip the first 2 years of having those epoxy table struggles. And those first 2 years are very, very painful and can be very expensive. So if you'd like some more information on that, you can check out my website, blacktailstudio.com. If you're wondering what happened, I had a little piece break off and I couldn't use the original chunk in there. So I had to take another piece of walnut, glue it in there, take a flush trim saw, cut it down, and then sand it flush. And I actually didn't tell my client about this until he saw the video. And after he saw the video, he called me and goes, "There's a big chunk missing out of my table." And I laughed because I knew that it didn't actually bother him. And he thought that it was a pretty good fix and admitted that he would have never noticed it had I not showed him in the video. I hope you like this table, but even more than that, I hope you like the video because I have a lot more videos like this. So if you want to see more like this, I would appreciate it if you hit that like and follow button. It does make a big difference to my page. I really appreciate you making it all the way to the end of the video. Thank you so much.